Western Europe is going to look like a third world. The United States now has a sort of stronger multi-generational aristocracy than Europe has. Extraordinary careers when you're a junior inventor do not get built sitting behind a desk in an office. Travis committed no crime. They just cornered him in a hotel room 2 days after his mother had passed away and convinced him to sign papers that he shouldn't have. I wish that, Bill Gurley's, firing of Travis was, sort of talked about more publicly about how morally depraved that entire basically situation was. Service Titan is actually closer to LVMH than it is to Tesla. The one-liner that I sometimes like to use is people love software because, sort of the marginal distribution costs are zero. Perhaps what people need to realize is also that the marginal returns are zero as well because there is no moat.
Ready to go? Delian, dude, I've been so looking forward to this one. I've been a fan of the tweets for a long time. Obviously, we met at Founders Fund many years ago, but thank you so much for doing this, man.
Of course, yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Been looking forward to the conversation as well.
Now, listen, I always like to start with like a really soft, easy one. I think we're shaped by our past. When you reflect back on yours, what was the most maybe challenging element of your past and growing up that shaped you and how you think today most, do you think?
I never felt like a true American when I was in the United States because of the Bulgarian heritage. And when I would go to Bulgaria, I would never feel truly Bulgarian because of the sort of time I spent in America. I remember one of the moments that I felt like I really realized, sort of that this was in some ways the fundamental cause of some of the challenges I had in both countries was I went back to Bulgaria. I used to go basically every summer as a kid until I was about like 13 or so. And then for the next couple of years as a teenager, I had like internships or, math camps, et cetera, just like things that kept me in the States. And then I went back when I was, I want to say like 19 years old for, maybe a month and a half. And I remember interacting with my cousin who's basically like, sort of my same age. Our dads are basically the same age. We like, grew up around each other all the time and they have like very similar personalities, backgrounds, like so many, we both like computer science, et cetera. In some ways, if you like squint, it's just kind of like what I would have looked like if I grew up basically, sort of in Bulgaria. And I had this realization after like spending, a couple weeks with him where I was like, oh, all these things that like made it very difficult for me to both date in the States, interact in the States, things that people would get mad at me about. It's not that I'm like some special unique snowflake that like, has these quirky personality traits. It's like, I'm just Bulgarian. Like I look at my cousin and I do the things that he does. And in Bulgaria, those are like totally acceptable and normal. And when you do those same things in the States, it's like, totally, sort of weird and you get, sort of bashed for it. And so, yeah, I feel like in some ways having this sort of like split identity, I mean, it's not obviously, anywhere near some of the personal stuff that you've shared, obviously on, sort of Twitter, et cetera. I feel very grateful to have had a healthy, happy, et cetera, sort of family in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, that sort of flows through to like how your parents parent you, how you communicate in the home, how you date, how you think about work, et cetera. And sort of having that like mixed identity always made me feel like I didn't really properly, sort of have a home.
Do you consider yourself a Bulgarian or an American today if you had to choose between the two?
I think it sort of flipped where post-college, falling in love with Silicon Valley, getting into the technology sphere, recognizing that a lot of the people that were super successful in Silicon Valley sort of had backgrounds like mine. I think in my, sort of heart of hearts, at the end of the day, it's just like, this is the greatest country on earth. And I think that, people should learn from, sort of this country. And I think actually, this is a tangent, but I actually think, Bulgaria also has an opportunity to be like one of the, sort of best European nations where when you look at United Kingdom, France, Spain, Germany, et cetera, they're all just like completely, sort of falling into societal collapse, all for, sort of slightly different reasons, but it comes down to a complete lack of, sort of nationalism, falling into basically like, sort of socialist states, constant, sort of regulation, versus if you look at sort of the Bulgaria, Romania, Poland sort of corridor, all of those countries still believe in capitalism because they, still feel the, dreads of the fall of the Soviet, sort of Union. They all believe in like engineering and mathematics as the, sort of way to develop society. And so if you look at the GDP growth of Eastern Europe relative to Western, Eastern is completely rocking, has way more interesting startups, is on a much more interesting trajectory. And so I think if you extrapolate this progress out for another decade, Western Europe is going to look like a third world, sort of country. Eastern Europe is going to be, sort of rivaling a lot of the first world, sort of countries.
Larry Summers said on the show that that Japan is a nursing home, China is a jail, and Europe is a museum. Would you agree with him?
Yes, other than the caveat of I think Eastern Europe is maybe sort of the only hope. Where if you look at Bulgaria in particular, one of the now largest nano satellite integrators, Endurosat, is this company that basically builds like sub 30 kilogram type satellites. Is based in Sofia. They have now built out this like 15-story skyscraper that has as nice facilities as we have here. And you can just feel the energy when you walk in. And by the way, the people that are working there, it's like a fourth or maybe a half of the team is like Italian, French, German, English that have escaped the sort of socialist, communist regimes of Western Europe to try and basically, work in a country that still believes in, sort of capitalism. And so I very much feel like I'm in the sort of like Ayn Rand, where is John Galt, sort of version of the world when I walk there, where it's like, these are the brightest and best people. And they're clearly, sort of escaping the museums of Western Europe. Now, will they want to stay in the EU? How is that going to work over the next sort of decade? I think what will probably happen is you see some of these countries actually start to leave the EU as Western Europe becomes more and more of a drag rather than a producer.
The show's become more and more successful because instead of being a sycophantic child, I've actually stood up for what I believe in. I agree with you partly, and I disagree with you. You cannot take away the culture, the heritage, and the hospitality of Europe. My dear American friends love nothing more than to come to London, to come to Paris, to come to Milan. We do culture, we do heritage like no one else in the world. My objection to you would be that is something you can't take away, and Americans love to spend money here. That's a great thing. We can build fucking huge economies on top of that. Does that not go against your statement of kind of Europe being or Western Europe being a third world country?
I think the moment that Europe decided to shut down and deny its aristocracy is when it started to, sort of decline. I believe in sort of the great man theory and the great, sort of family theories. And
what is the great man theory and the great family theories, and how does that?
Just that, it's sort of the opposite of the, sort of Chinese philosophies of, sort of the individual, does not matter. All that matters is the sort of society, the state, and the, sort of collective. The history of Europe is, sort of great men. And in some ways, one could argue that perhaps the, sort of one of the last, few great men of Europe was, Napoleon. And, since then it's been a, sort of strict decline post-Napoleonic, sort of wars. The, sort of family theory in some ways is, a subsidiary of that, which is that the, sort of great, cathedrals, great monuments, great movements only get built over, sort of a multitude of generations. And the best way to, sort of maintain that effort towards a multi-generational, sort of effort comes from the, sort of fundamental bloodlines. I think in some ways, I would actually argue that the United States now has a sort of stronger multi-generational aristocracy than Europe has. And I think that's a contributor to some of the success we have. I think what the United States does really well is you still have the Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, et cetera, families creating culture, creating institutions, while you also enable the next generation sort of, up and comers that, disrupt wealth systems, the elite, et cetera, part of, I think, a lot of our, sort of societal divisiveness right now in the United States mostly has to do with sort of the elite transfer of power from the sort of what I would call the, and this is more of my wife's theory than my own, but I've definitely, glommed onto it, but from the sort of Davos elite that, in some ways began in the 1920s to now the, sort of technological elite. But you'll almost certainly see similar trends there. If you don't think that the, sort of Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, et cetera analogy is not going to be the Musks, the Zuckerbergs, the, sort of Bezoses, that almost certainly, sort of will be, the case over the course of the next, sort of 100 years, where these, sort of family lines are going to have significant impact on the shaping of our, sort of future in the United States. But I think, sort of Europe has completely, sort of discarded that and is so vehemently against, sort of that aristocratic elite in some ways from a broad political level, but not from a societal wealth level, right? So if you look at the best companies in Europe, LVMH is the epitome of aristocracy and is, the biggest in some ways, sort of company in Europe. And yet Europe hates, sort of aristocracy at a sort of political level, versus at least in the United States, we will admit that we, are okay with having, an aristocracy. We don't try to pass a 90%, inheritance tax.
I mean this nicely. My mother always told me, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I look to your wonderful nation, and I see a country with a terrible, woeful healthcare system. I see incredible levels of homelessness, which are just devastating. I see gun crime that's out of control, where people don't want to send their kids to school and going to a mall is dangerous. I see an infrastructure which is just ripe for civil unrest with this election and with some of the latest political things that we've seen. I'm kind of going, respectfully, who the fuck are you to judge us?
At the same time, in the first 6 months of 2024, Europe did not launch a single orbital rocket. You guys did not send a single kilogram of matter from the surface of the Earth into space. The United States, I'd probably, roughly estimate 180 days. We've been launching roughly every, call it, day and a half on average. We've probably done 130 launches in the first 6 months of 2024. And I think the American system, what it enables is both ends of the risk curve. We both have the downside sort of part of the risk curve where you have the homeless, the gun violence, et cetera. But we also enable the opposite end of the risk curve, the Musks, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. And in some ways, you can't get one without the other. If you want an Elon Musk type figure that can do sort of crazy things, you also have to be somewhat allowing of the other side of the crazy, which is, sort of the drug addicts on the sort of streets of San Francisco. And perhaps we should get a bit better at that and not only clean it up when Xi Jinping comes and visits, but, in some ways, maybe you don't have the Elon Musks without the drug addicts.
God, I'm enjoying it.
And maybe they're both drug addicts.
I mean, no comment. In case I ever want to get either of them on the show, I'm saying nothing. I love a show where you can just freewheel. Listen, I do want to revert to some form of schedule. You mentioned, in terms of feeling Bulgarian, feeling American, like getting into the Silicon Valley scene. One of the most pivotal moments was, I think, probably meeting Keith, one of the most important people in your early career, I spoke to him before the show and he said, dude, you've got to ask, how did we meet? And just get that story first.
Yeah. So in summer 2012, I ended up being an intern at Square. I was actually 18 at the time, and was just so thrilled to be in just what I saw as the center of, technological, sort of innovation. And at the time, Keith was the COO of Square, and the company was just on this explosive growth trajectory. I think when I interviewed, the company was at 100 person headcount. When I joined, 120. By the end of the summer, it was over 300. However, it was also one of the first times that the sort of company had a bit of a sort of hiccup. And so late July 2012, the company basically didn't experience a natural sort of 10 to 15% growth month over month. And up until then, the company, without really spending much on marketing, much on distribution, had been growing effectively through this feedback loop that I think a multitude of people have sort of talked about online. But basically, they would sell these little Square card readers, and people would go into a coffee shop, and 1 out of every 100 people that went to the coffee shop happened to be another local business owner, saw the physical reader, and then would sign up basically online. And so you had this basically natural viral loop where the company never basically had to spend on marketing for the first sort of 5+ years of its life. And then all of a sudden July hits and the company doesn't grow. And there was sort of this existential dread and panic at the company where it's oh God, we in some ways have not been in control of our growth. What if it is suddenly the magic, sort of the golden goose has stopped, sort of laying eggs? And Keith at the time was COO. And he did this, sort of phenomenal all hands presentation. I want to say it was August 5th, 8th, sort of 2012, where at the time, to me, as a, sort of lowly software engineer that had grown up around a family of economists, statisticians, I saw it as just statistical wizardry being applied to business. Now, obviously being a bit more sophisticated, it was a cohort analysis, but still, if you've never seen anything like that and you think about the world of business as this thing where it's backroom deals, it's Mad Men, and they're sort of marketing stunts, et cetera. You nowhere in the world of business movies do you ever see statistics applied to business. And so he runs through this cohort analysis, in front of the whole company. And basically the net of the analysis is, look, actually every year for the past few years, we've always seen a dip of our cohorts in terms of activity in July because we operate in local SMBs, and local SMBs in the United States, a lot of them go on vacation, et cetera, during July. And so there is just lower volume. And historically, our new cohorts were large enough to mitigate the effects of the historical ones. But now we're at such a large book of business that our new July cohort could not mitigate basically the sort of decrease of growth from the former July ones. And so he basically showed statistically that he could predict that even though we had basically no growth in July, that we were going to experience 20+% growth in August because all of the cohorts were going to come back and we were going to add a new one. And lo and behold, in August, the early data showed that we were growing basically sort of like crazy. And I just remember this moment being in the crowd of the 140 people that were there. I was wow. I had no idea math was involved in running businesses. Like I thought math was only used to like build products, solve problems, etc. And I remember just thinking, I was like, whatever I do later in life, I don't want to be doing this like, software engineering coding thing. It's like, fine, I'm a, pretty solid engineer, but it's not what I see myself doing for the next, 20, 40 years of my career. I want to do what that guy's doing. And I need to figure out, basically how to get to know him. And so we didn't, sort of speak or anything while I was at Square. But then about, sort of 7 or 8 months later, I pinged him because I was about to sort of move out to Silicon Valley full time, dropping out of MIT. And I'd just been sort of awarded the, or was in the process of applying for the Teal Fellowship. And I pinged him and I was like, hey, going to be moving out. You're now a VC. I would love to just like, grab lunch once a month. You may remember me. I was an intern basically at Square. And I sent him this cold email and he replied within, I think on the order of like 5 or 6 hours and hopped on the phone with me the next day, which I just assumed was, sort of his standard response rate. That was how he liked to, sort of manage his inbox and, calendar. But, sort of 5 or 6 years later, once I had gotten to know him, I did ask him, I was like, you do not normally respond to cold emails from like a random intern and hop on the phone the next day. Sort of why were you willing to do that with me? And he was like, well, I was the COO of Square, while you were there that summer. And Square is a very, let's say, pernicky or finicky, culture. It's a bunch of designers that all like their, desks being prim and proper. And if the like smoothies in the morning have too much banana content, I get like 5 emails, sort of about it. And yet you would arrive into the office every single day wearing like short shorts and a tank top. You would like climb on the AC ducts. You would be loud. You'd be quite disruptive to the office. But I never got a single complaint from anybody on your team, anybody that sat next to you. And so just my conclusion was this guy must be a really good engineer for everybody to be willing to tolerate his ridiculous behavior. So I should, figure out what this guy, sort of is up to. But yeah, we started basically grabbing lunch, once a month in Silicon Valley. And eventually he, had me join his, sort of soccer team. And that's how we really got to know one
It's
another.
so funny you said about the smoothie there. I always remember him telling me about the smoothie test where you start with obviously a very simple task and then you expand the complexity of it kind of over time to get harder and see someone's capabilities. I do have to ask you, speaking of kind of lessons from Keith there, kind of a quick fire on Keith, but so many people had so many questions. When you think about 3 different components, operating, what to look for in founders and what to look for in companies. First, what did Keith teach you about operating most significantly?
A ton of lessons there, but when I think about the one that has been sort of the most strategic, sort of impact, let's say, on my life in particular, in terms of how basically, sort of Varda came together, was sort of what he calls his like sort of Hollywood, sort of analogy of, sort of building companies, where, if you look at the best studios, they don't, sort of A/B test their way into, sort of building a film. The script writers write a script and they have a story that they really strongly believe in. And once they've written that story, they think through, sort of who should be the, sort of major, cast for each one. And so when they're making the Mission Impossible films, they don't go and interview 30 people and they debate, should they have Tom Hanks or Tom Cruise? It's like, no, it's an action movie. It's going to be Tom Cruise and he's going to do these basically crazy stunts. And then they might put out a sort of short preview, but they go and spend 100 million, 200 million and go fully produce the film and then put it out, in the public, sort of fully, produced, versus in some ways the 2010s, sort of false or antithesis of this mentality was the whole sort of lean startup approach of like A/B test your way towards sort of your grand vision. And in some ways, this was how he sort of built the early days of Open Door. Was he thought through what were going to be the sort of major risks, how should the company be built, and then in some ways went out and hunted down the individual co-founders that were the sort of the best suited for the role. They were the Tom Cruise for the sort of Mission Impossible. And so as I was thinking about sort of the thesis around sort of Varda, I took the same approach where I was like, okay, what are the sort of fundamental core risks of this type of business? And in some ways found the ideal casting and went through basically castings effectively to find what those ideal co-founders were. And then we just went and raised the money and built the thing. And it wasn't like we waited on sort of customer feedback, et cetera. Like people ask me like, did you get LOI, et cetera? I was like, no, we just like had a strong vision for the future of the world, went and built the team and raised the money to go do it, and then went and did it. In some ways now obviously have many customers, but didn't rely on sort of the quote unquote customer feedback in the early days of putting together that.
It's vision. Just so interesting because it goes against everything that everyone has ever taught and everything that we're taught as investors, which is customer feedback, close proximity to customers, really listening, qualification processes. It just flies in the face of that, does it not?
It works in the world of like small SaaS businesses where you're trying to make a marginal improvement on a small industry. If you're doing workflow software for plumbers, I'm sure that is a like reasonable approach. I don't think that Elon Musk went around interviewing consumers about whether or not they wanted electric vehicles when he decided to go build Tesla, or asked NASA whether they want sort of cheaper and better rockets when he went to go build SpaceX. And so I think it works for sure a subset of companies. But if you look at the top 10 companies on the NASDAQ, Steve Jobs did not ask people for their feedback when building the iPhone. Jensen Huang did not ask people whether they sort of wanted parallel compute sort of GPUs. They just had strong visions of what they thought the future of technology looked like and went and sort of built that.
You mentioned some of those incredible kind of category defining founders. What did Keith teach you about the founders that you want to get behind and invest in?
Probably the sort of singular, sort of lesson is just what he calls sort of the spark, where, there is no one archetype of great founder, right? If you look at Zuckerberg, if you look at Steve Jobs, if you look at Elon Musk, if you look at Jensen Huang, completely different personalities, personal stories, the way they like to run their companies, right? But I think what they all have is this just unique attribute thing that they sort of excel in the 99th sort of percentile on, that may not always necessarily have to be sort of specifically related to the company that they're working on. Like the way this sometimes shows up practically is a lot of times we'll end up getting really excited at Founders Fund to sort of back a particular founder because they happen to be like world class in some super esoteric sort of field, whether that's like the cognition sort of AI founders that crushed it at IOI, to people that did really well in sort of college athletics, to Ryan Peterson sort of running his sort of freight forwarding sort of company from whenever he was like 18 years old. And I think it's sort of looking for and identifying that spark and seeing how does that spark translate to the thing that they're sort of working on, very obviously sort of being their sort of life's work. I don't know, I carry that with me every day anytime that I'm looking to work with a founder.
I agree. I get like literally very uncomfortable when they're like, for my next thing I'm going to do this, and I'm like, oh. Like for me, I there's only one thing I'm doing, is 20 VC. Like I started when I was 18. I will die doing 20 VC, and I'll be very happy if that's the case, if they keep me here long enough. But I couldn't agree with you more there. I also find, one, immigrant founders generally outperform, and then two, the time with which you do your first entrepreneurial endeavor generally correlates to success. No one comes out of MIT and is like, I'll start a business for the first time. You always did something first, started phone repairs, whatever it is, when you were a teenager. So I totally agree with you there. Dude, when you were at Khosla with Keith, you were a junior VC, if you don't mind me saying it. What are you,
Yep.
And you crushed. Like the track we mentioned before is phenomenal. What are your single biggest lessons on how to succeed in the world of junior VC?
If I were to sort of boil down, I think what the success ultimately came down to, it was just a willingness to do things that the GPs weren't willing to do, and using that as the sort of differentiating sort of trait. In particular, the Sword Health example is an obvious one where the idea of this type of sort of digitized AI, musculoskeletal sort of therapy was one that had been debated sort of internally within the walls of KV. But once sort of Virgilio, the CEO of Sword, sort of reached out to me and said, I'd love to sort of chat with you. I was just immediately willing to dive incredibly deep into the company, both reading their scientific papers, which no other investor was willing to do, because again, most more senior VCs have boards, they have a ton of things on their plate. I mean, I feel this very much so, sort of today, my ability to, we can talk about the sort of Brian related questions on how does Varda make me a worse VC. One of the examples is like, I'm not willing to do the things that I was willing to do back in the Sword Health sort of diligence process, which was go incredibly deep on like the sort of science and tech of the company. But then also within a week of like a cold email, I hopped on a flight, and took a red eye out to Portugal to go through a very extensive, exhaustive sort of diligence with the company. And then also sort of managed to convince the KV partnership that the following week we should have them basically present to the whole firm. No matter how compelling, sort of the opportunity is, the GP of Khosla Ventures, Vinod, Samir, David Wyden, Keith, Sven, no matter how compelling, there's just no way that they're hopping on a 1 week turnaround to a red eye to Europe to go meet a random founder. And you have to be willing to do those types of things as a junior VC and gamble on this sort of top of funnel aperture, on opportunities in a way that the GPs are not. I always say,
can I interrupt you and be awful? I don't know the others, but I love Vinod and I love Keith. But like, do the best not example. I sent Tom Tungas a deal on a Thursday. He flew to London on a Friday. He won the deal on a Saturday. He beat out everyone in London. The guys at IVP fly to bumfuck nowhere, Romania, to do UiPath. Sorry if anyone's in Romania. They fly to, bumfuck nowhere, Germany. See, I equated both, so everywhere's bumfuck. Bumfuck nowhere, Germany. So to do DeepL. Do the best not get on planes?
They do, but again, there's, some level of turnaround of Keith's schedule, as an example, is booked a full 3-4 weeks in advance. The idea that it's going to be a week-long turnaround is impossible. And for his activation energy, it has to be that junior investors have gone and done some level of diligence, built conviction. And for sure, to say he will do it at some point, but I was just willing to do it faster, quicker turnaround, and dive much, much deeper than what they would be capable of doing. But that was the value that I provided to the table, where I came back within 2 weeks and said, hey, I've gone and visited a management team in person. I've run through the list of 100 questions that Vinod basically wanted me to make sure that I did while I was in Portugal. And I feel high conviction that we should invite these founders to the United States, pay for their flights to basically, sort of come, sort of pitch the, sort of partnership. So it's not to say that the elite GPs don't go and do it, but again, it's just a different turnaround time, et cetera. The analogy that I like to, or the one line mantra is just, I think extraordinary careers when you're a junior in venture do not get built sitting behind a desk in an office and behind a laptop. It is, you have to be willing to go meet with founders in person, figure out how to sort of understand their businesses and how to convince them to even spend time with you when you're not one of the big general partners.
I'm sure you have a lot of people ask you for advice on entering venture. I have a lot of people ask me, and they're like, should I try and do as many deals as possible? Should I try and do few? What's your advice on do many, do few?
Probably, sort of use the same anecdote that, sort of Trey and Brian, I think, shared on their, sort of interviews, which is, I think in your first year of VC, you do want to just open your aperture and build your sort of data set on, sort of founders where, again, that first year, I think I was effectively willing to meet almost any, sort of founder that was willing to, sort of meet with me and vice versa. Once you've, sort of met, call it on the order of 1,000 founders, and especially if in that, sort of 1,000, you are fortunate enough to have a data set of founders that look like Parker Conrad, Eric Kleiman, Alex Wang, et cetera, you start to have an understanding of, sort of what does greatness, sort of look like. I think you should be very judicious on waiting to pull the trigger until, you feel like you have identified the taste, for what that greatness looks like.
I thought it was fascinating when I spoke to Keith, and he said actually relevance is my biggest challenge, actually, and making sure that we stay at the forefront of the best founders. I appreciated his honesty, but I also thought it was fascinating. I'd also think for poor Peter's sake, there is a little bit of a difference in age between Peter and Vinod, as wonderful as Vinod is. I didn't want to lump them in necessarily the same bucket. I do have to ask you, what are the biggest fuck-ups you see young VCs make today in career planning in venture?
Ultimately, you need to recognize that venture is the most sort of commoditized, let's say industry within sort of tech. You have no moat other than your brand. The product that you deliver at the end of the day is US dollars, just like anybody else can deliver sort of that fundamental product. People don't focus enough on sort of differentiation. They come in and they try to do all aspects of VC generically well and focus on a multitude of sectors generically well. I think it was Sarah Tavel, who, Benchmark may not, sort of love me for various comments that I make, but I do like Sarah's, sort of framework, and I use it all the time, which is there's sort of, 4 or 5 aspects to, sort of VC, and late stage in your career, you do kind of need to be world-class at least 3 of those, but early on, you need to focus on one. And, so the 5 that she breaks down is 1, you basically need a, sort of top of funnel, way to basically source, whether that's more marketing or sales driven. You then need to, sort of develop a nose for what are the deals that you yourself like and want to champion. You then need to, develop a skill set for championing those, investments that you like within the firm. So basically the internal, selling. You then need to also do the external selling of convincing basically the founders that they should take, your capital relative to anybody else's. And then post-investment, you need to help that founder basically manage the business and, exit. Trying to be great at all 5 is a completely, sort of impossible, sort of task. Obviously, there are people within Founders Fund that explicitly choose to not work on the 5th one, sort of whatsoever, right? Brian and Trey's, sort of strategy is we believe the best founders, sort of need no help, and we are not going to try to differentiate on, sort of helping founders. I, thankfully love to work at a place where we can agree to disagree on investment strategies, and I enjoy differentiating myself on the 5th, and I think it helps with other, sort of categories. But I think junior VCs make the mistake of let me try to do all of these and across a multitude of sectors versus I think I just early on decided I'm going to focus on 2 core things that I'm going to differentiate myself on. I'm going to spend a lot of time in frontier tech and in particular in aerospace and understand that entire industry extremely well so that anytime somebody thinks about a space deal, they immediately, think of me top of mind versus if you don't have that type of defining trait, you're just not going to be top of mind when people are thinking about co-investors, and that's the ultimate, sort of failure case. And out of all of those 5 things, I'm actually going to focus on that 5th one first. So rather than even trying to, sort of source and understand, sort of my taste, et cetera, I'm actually going to make myself extremely useful to Keith's pre-existing portfolio of founders, so that when one day I need to have try to attempt a deal, Max Rhodes, the CEO of Fair, will be willing to hop on the phone and say, look, Delian was obviously not the person that sourced or led our deal, but ultimately was very valuable to the company in like XYZ ways. You should take his capital. And so when you look at, I believe it was True Work, it was literally the sort of founder reference of Max that ultimately, sort of helped me, sort of get that, sort of deal across the line, which obviously then made me better at, sort of part 4 of the job.
You mentioned getting deals across the line internally there. Can I ask you, has there been a deal? Have you had a deal where you wanted desperately to get it over the line and it didn't go over the line?
Yeah, my biggest, sort of miss, investment, and one that I sort of think about a lot was in December 2019. Maybe it was like November. I had the opportunity to double down on Sword and invest in the company, basically sort of 10 on 100 million post. And we had previously actually done a sort of smaller check into Sword basically as soon as I joined Founders Fund from KV. I really wanted to, really believe in the company and wanted to double down. I was still pretty new to FF, and I don't think I just set up the argument for why we should do it correctly or built enough basically internal consensus in some ways before, sort of going to Peter at FF. I think counterintuitively, I think your sort of best way to get a deal across the line at FF is actually to probably go to the most junior person at FF and have them start to build, sort of consensus amongst a, sort of wider group. Like if you look at FF, I feel like a lot of the deals sort of percolate from below. And as, sort of their set of people, it doesn't have to be the entire firm, but let's say a subset of like 2 or 3 people that are really high conviction. And then even if it's a later stage check that requires basically Peter's approval, it's with that, sort of broader conviction that it's, sort of brought to the GP of the firm. Those tend to be actually how a lot of our later stage, sort of deals, sort of get across the line. And so I think there I, sort of critique myself for being so high conviction myself that I just tried to go sort of straight to Peter, sort of rather than, working within, sort of the broader set of the firm and including people that actually had been part of the consensus in earlier checks that we had done at Sword at Founders Fund. But yeah, that one, is a, sort of painful one, given that would be, sort of $10 million. That would be a $300 million position, today. And I definitely lose sleep over that. And so I think about that a lot, today, where one way that we like to, sort of say it internally is you should always go for the path of most resistance when, trying to work on a deal at FF. Work and make sure to loop people in from the investment team that are going to be the most critical of the company, given that one, if you're able to get those people to conviction, then bringing it to the sort of, sort of GP shows that you've really, sort of done your homework internally versus I think that 10 on $100 million post one, I didn't do my homework.
What is the biggest flaw of the FF investment decision-making process today, do you think?
Let's see. I mean, sort of relative to, sort of other, let's say, tier 1 elite firms over the past 5 years, in some ways, we haven't gotten ourselves into trouble.
Some names around this, Delian? It's really unfair of me, but tier 1 elite firms, which 3 do you most respect?
It's probably Sequoia, Andreessen, and probably more historical benchmark than modern benchmark, but I still think there's lessons to be had, sort of there. And obviously all 3 of those firms operate, sort of in very different ways. And, if I were to look over the past sort of 5 years, I think generally the Founders Fund decision-making has led to generally superior returns and also less gaffes in various ways, whether it's the sort of FTX type sort of fraud debacles, whether it's the holding publics beyond when you should on behalf of your LPs.
Is there anything you'd change about it then?
If anything, the biggest change is I would double down on what we've done sort of best historically, which is if you look at the general partners today at Founders Fund beyond Peter, which is sort of Brian Singerman, Trey Stevens, Napoleon, sort of Ta. All 3 of them began as either interns or relatively junior investors at Founders Fund over a decade ago. And I think the best thing that we could be doing today is ensuring that we have people on the team today that in a decade are going to be the future, sort of Brian, Napoleon's, sort of Treys. I think right now, technically, sort of full time at Founders Fund, there is only, sort of one person that is under the age of 20, sort of 7. And that is probably not a, sort of sufficient class of, sort of future up and coming investors that would, sort of be those future general partners in 10, 15, sort of 20 years. So I would say probably the biggest change would be double down on what we've done best in the past and do it again.
You mentioned Brian many times there. I love Brian. I had him on the show a couple of times. Wonderful dude. Spoke to him beforehand. He said you have to ask him, what makes Founders Fund so special, with the addendum that very few people do not know or consider? So not the contrarian mind. Yeah, we like big plans and big ideas. Everyone knows that. What that not many people see makes them so special?
I think the thing that is probably most underappreciated, the fact that the team is very small allows for there to be very strong sort of personal relationships, where obviously in any network, the number of, sort of network connections grows by n squared. And so the fact that, I probably won't do the, sort of counting perfectly, but I think there's, call it 11, 12 of us on the investment team today. And so, on the order of, n squared, 130 basically permutations of, sort of connections, that's actually, sort of relatively, sort of possible to maintain quite strongly. Once you actually go to even, sort of 20, at that point, you're talking about 400, which then basically becomes impossible to maintain. And what that allows us to do, and the way that we sort of do our economics, which is, sort of not on there's no sort of deal by deal, sort of basis, makes it so that the firm is far more collaborative than I think people expect, in terms of many of the even intro calls that we take. We'll have multiple people on the firm, and there's not jockeying around sort of who was the most point person and who gets to claim the most basically, sort of credit for an individual investment. That type of politicking sort of doesn't really exist, because I think a combination of the team size being small and the personal connections being strong and the way the economics are structured. And so much of what we do, it's not to the level of benchmarks, full sort of consensus, everybody needs to vote on it culture. But by far, if you look at the best investments, it's when 3 or 4 sort of investors collaborated significantly to get to conviction on a particular investment, but also that the rest of the firm didn't like the investment. And I think it's only possible to both collaborate to that depth and also get deals across this sort of line, even if the rest of the firm doesn't like it, when you have that very small, collaborative, and, basically, very personally close structure. One, sort of anecdote that I'd use that maybe reflects this is Brian, when we do our sort of once every, year or 2 year, basically annual retreat with the whole team. One of the core things that we basically go through in that his speech that he gives is both who has joined, the firm since then, but also what children have been born into the sort of Founders Fund, sort of family since the last time, we all got together. And in some ways, maybe that anecdote is reflective of that, sort of collaborative familial culture.
Gosh, that's really corny. I didn't know Brian had that sweet side. No, listen, I do have to ask, when we think about, you said they're voting, do you think voting in investment decision-making partnerships is BS?
I think at most cultures it is. There are some exceptions, obviously, sort of think benchmarks truly is, right? It is, there is one vote, it's either one or I think they actually do have a conviction, sort of rating. But at the end of the day, it's consensus based, which is everybody's vote has to be above a certain tier, which ends up making it so the voting is basically sort of 1 or 0. That to me is a very legitimate, ultimately voting. Is there, perhaps, I don't know the culture well enough, is there back office politicking, et cetera, to, sort of get to consensus, sort of potentially, and so does that, sort of discount the quality of the votes, sort of potentially. One thing that I really like about, sort of Founders Fund is, even though our, let's say, time allocation as a team is very unstructured. We don't do Monday partner meetings. There's not some regular cadence where we all get together and discuss, sort of deals and decide which ones, sort of we're going to, sort of do. Incredibly unstructured. But the voting and decision making and across, and I think back in the day, Simon Bannister gave a public interview sort of about this, about how we have basically sort of tiers of check sizes, and in order to get those basically checks across, there's just certain basically sizes of basically a number of sort of votes that you need to get across. It makes it so that, as an individual investor, it's incredibly structured in terms of, if I want to do X, Y, and Z investment, I know exactly who I need to basically, sort of get on board with this type of deal. And there's incredible comfort with, just because one general partner does not want to provide the vote does not then mean that you're shut down across the firm. You are more than welcome to try and convince another, sort of general partner to get it across. Versus, I think a lot of firms, once you feel like, one general partner has said no, you can't, sort of go to the rest. And so I do think that at Founders Fund, it is very legitimate in terms of voting. And I think there are firms where it generally is. There are definitely firms where the voting doesn't matter. What matters is just like, the partner meeting, and you kind of all look around the table, but it's mostly like, do the most senior GPs want to do it or not? And it kind of doesn't matter what the rest of the votes are.
We mentioned like getting the votes, getting over the line internally. There's also winning the deal once they submit the term sheet. Have you lost a deal, Delian?
Recently, sort of came back up because one of the founders that I lost the deal on, for some reason, brought up the sort of thread where I sort of mentioned him, not directly, but somebody asked me what deals have you lost, and I mentioned him sort of vaguely. He replied to that tweet and was like, the biggest mistake of my company building was actually turning down Delian's term sheet. So that was a very flattering thing to hear.
What was the company, and what did you take from it?
It was this guy, Nathaniel. I guess since he's now sort of publicly confirmed it himself, I think it's fine to say. It was this guy, Nathaniel Manning, at this company that was doing basically wildfire sort of insurance, tech-enabled, using satellite data, et cetera. And I think ultimately that sort of failure point came down to just, COVID era. I think the company or the founders were not based in the sort of Bay Area where I was at the time. And so we just weren't quite able to meet in person, even though I was willing to sort of fly, et cetera, just in the time frame that he wanted to ultimately sort of come to a decision. And so he ultimately ended up choosing a firm where he had...
because you were older and you weren't willing to get on a plane so quickly?
So I think there it was just like, I didn't, get to it, in terms of top of funnel quickly enough relative to the round dynamics. But yeah, it was, sort of that one. And then in that thread, I mentioned a second, which is not necessarily coming to me today. So I'd have to think about it. I would guess that it was a, sort of double down on a, sort of portfolio company, where I think if I were to critique myself there, I probably, sort of felt entitled to the ability to double down. Now, I've been on the other side of the table, sort of many times, and investor entitledness can, really rub you the wrong way as a founder. Nobody's entitled to their pro rata.
That's interesting because it is a legal right.
Yes, but things in Silicon Valley don't always operate according to the legality. They do sometimes operate according to a little bit of the character, reputation, sort of, et cetera. Obviously, we're seeing this kind of play out in the drama sphere of Twitter over the past 24, 48 hours with Parker Conrad, Vinod, Mike Solana, David Sachs, et cetera.
Do you think this is good for our ecosystem, or it makes us seem like rich brats who need to get on with the real world and actually get on with our jobs, managing money for some of the biggest institutions in the world who we're lucky to manage money for?
I think that for the future generation of founders, I think that it is valuable that people's characters are laid on display. And it's not to say that anyone comes off unscathed in any of these things, right? Whether you're on the sort of Parker versus David Sachs side of it, both sides have shown pros and both sides have shown cons. And I think that's valuable because then you as a founder can sort of self-select into it, where I think one of the questions that you sort of threw in the agenda was, has your divisiveness on Twitter, sort of lost you or won you a deal? I'm sure that it has. I'm sure that there is a set of founders that have chosen to just not reach out to me whatsoever because of, my, sort of philosophy. But there's also a set of founders that have self-selected into proactively wanting to sort of work with me. Eric and Kareem of Ramp, maybe being a perfect example of this, of really wanting to opt into the immigrant, anti-woke, et cetera, sort of mentality, and have that be a sort of core part of the sort of early culture. And so, I wish that, Bill Gurley's, firing of Travis, was, sort of talked about more publicly about how morally depraved that entire basically situation was, so that people can choose to opt into, is that, a firm that you want to work with? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think that stuff should be, sort of more on display than not, more for sake of not the VCs winning a point on one another publicly and getting attention for it, but more for the founders to understand how this shit actually happens behind the scenes.
How do you think about a challenging situation? You mentioned Bill and Uber there. I'm not directly addressing that. I'm just saying, when the fiduciary responsibility that you have to your investors, which is to return the most amount of money possible, is no longer aligned to the best interests of the founder. A great example of this is when you want to sell your position. You may need the liquidity then, your LPs may want the liquidity then, but as a lead investor, that looks bad for the founder and for the company. There is now a misalignment between the two. What wins?
Obviously part of why I really enjoy working at Founders Fund is because of the sort of fundamental, sort of mantra of the firm and why it was started. And, sort of 2004, the idea of sort of founder-friendly VCs and not firing founders was, extremely contrarian. Obviously, it's become somewhat consensus, not entirely. There are, firms, tier ones that I mentioned, Benchmark, A16Z, Sequoia, et cetera, all have examples of, sort of founder oustings, in the past, sort of decade. And so in some ways, it continues to actually be at least somewhat, sort of contrarian.
Do you really agree with that? That is like saying I will enter into a marriage and we will never get divorced. Well, that's moronic. Of course, you should have the option to get divorced. You should never have the divine right to be an investor at Founders Fund. If you don't perform, you won't be there.
Yes, but I think if you just, if you look at the fundamental job of venture capitalists, is to provide basically, a sort of high beta strategy. And if you look at the highest, sort of beta outcomes in the world, they are all founder-led companies. And so ultimately, even if you disagree with the approach, even if you think that, perhaps the sort of company could provide some liquidity if you get rid of the founder, I think, in some ways, obviously, sort of benchmark LPs made a lot of money by, sort of Dara becoming the CEO, taking the company public, and today it's cash flow profitability. But perhaps those benchmark LPs would have made even more money if Travis was still CEO and the future of self-driving cars lived within Uber rather than living within Google. And maybe Uber becomes a $1 trillion company over the course of the 2020s if, Travis is at the helm rather than Dara. And so I think in some ways you shouldn't overly rely on history. However, Darwinistically, founder-led companies are the only ones that generate the sort of returns that matter for VC, and so
I agree,
you should be focused on that over anything else.
I agree, and totally, I'm 100% with you. I hate it when founders I meet say, "Oh, I'm a 0 to 1 person." I'm like, great, I'm an out person. Like, that's not what we're here for. But do you agree with what I'm saying? No one has a divine right to their position. As an investor, you also have an obligation to the employees within a company, and if someone is not doing the work, lazy, lying, they don't have a divine right to the position to be there.
Travis committed no crime, and they sort of ousted him despite the fact that they actually didn't necessarily have the legal control to do so. They just cornered him in a hotel room 2 days after his mother had passed away and convinced him to sign papers that he sort of shouldn't have.
If you weren't good enough as the founder of Varda, say in 3 years' time, whatever, you didn't scale into it, do you not think Founders Fund or Khosla should be able to remove you?
No, because I think ultimately, in order to deliver generational returns, there's no way for that to happen other than the founder still being at the helm. The moment that you install a professional CEO, that person doesn't have the same level of moral authority or capability to sort of take risks that require the risks that are required to take in order to sort of generate those types of true end tail.
Do you not
outcomes.
think Satya Nadella disproves that? Very bold risks, writing $1 billion check to OpenAI, completely transforming a business that Steve Ballmer had let plateau.
And, yet Zuck releases, whatever Llama, 3 or 4, and releases it completely free and open source. And it is beating all the benchmarks of anything that OpenAI and Microsoft have ever done. And so perhaps that actually doesn't matter. And it turns out Zuckerberg is going to be the massive, sort of AI platform. And it's because he's willing to take risks and invest into a level of H100s that, Satya was not willing to do because Satya had to, ultimately, serve the, sort of public markets versus Zuckerberg still has penultimate control over everything that sort of Facebook does. And so it's not to say that professional CEOs can't take it, sort of some amount of the way. And obviously Satya has delivered phenomenal returns to investors. But I still think at the end of the day, those end tail outcomes aren't possible without founder-led companies.
This is very clever positioning from you. Okay, because you look like a great guy and I look like an evil old VC. To be clear, I completely agree with the founder-led companies being the most important and valuable for anyone thinking that I'm a dick listening. So I totally understand and agree. I do have to ask, that is a very strong statement from Founders Fund on the founder-led companies and always sticking with founders. When you think about something that you believe, I like this question from Twitter. What do you believe that the Founders Fund partnership will heavily disagree with you on?
I want to, because this is, sort of brought up a point, if there's a thing that I've learned from Peter the most, it is there's always a way to structure your arguments such that you are on the winning side no matter what and look the best. And I think he does a phenomenal job of that, of structuring his sort of logic, arguments, and frameworks in a way where if you disagree with him, you by default just look like a buffoon because of the fundamental way that the argument is basically sort of structured. And so that's probably the number one thing that I've learned from Peter is being very diligent in how I structure my logic such that if you disagree with me, you look foolish.
Can I ask, before we dive into what you believe that Founders Fund disagree with you on, Peter is such a large presence, important person, influential figure. When he's in a room, how do you prevent the weight of his words being the only words that matter?
I actually think it goes back again to that sort of familial nature at Founders Fund. I think because he maintains such closeness to everyone on the team, and obviously it's when you're in your first year there, it's probably more difficult. But once you're sort of 5 years in, at that point you've spent sort of so much time with him that the sort of star power or, sort of weight of words, et cetera, sort of goes away when you get to know the sort of individual behind the sort of star. And so, if anything, he values sort of people that are willing to actually sort of disagree and stand up to him, so much so that I think it incentivizes behavior internally where people proactively want to disagree with him more than others. And so actually, if anything, the like reverse effect, sort of happens. I remember there was this particular, sort of moment right after the Keith departure. And I was obviously, sort of feeling in some ways very emotionally raw. We were having this sort of team meeting where there was this like discussion about, sort of candidates and who we wanted to bring onto the team. And there was this person that, sort of Peter was particularly excited by. And I remember I just like proactively jumped in, and I don't want to go into the details partially because it'll probably reveal who the person is, and it's a little sort of confidential. But anyways, I just proactively just like jumped in, and I was like, Peter, I think that is probably the worst candidate idea that anybody has like sort of brought up to the firm in like the sort of last 6 months. And I feel about this so strongly that we just discussed this sort of framework of path of most resistance. We should have XYZ GP meet this person as a part of the interview process. And Peter goes, well, why should that person meet? This person would be, sort of a venture, sort of candidate. This GP may not be the right person to, sort of assess. And I was like, because I know that this GP will hate this person, and that will absolutely guarantee that we do not, sort of hire this person. So anyways, point big, I think, even on a tactical day-to-day level, I actually don't think, sort of this happens. If anything, the, sort of reverse, effect actually sometimes happens.
Tell me, what do you believe that the majority of the partnership will disagree with you on?
I think it's that, sort of fifth part of the venture job. Trey and Brian are more than welcome to take their approach of, sort of write a check to a founder, but then largely, sort of be hands off from there, because the best founders, don't ask for help. The best founders in my portfolio have looked to people that they, sort of really, value their opinion of, and want those people, sort of around the table. And so, I do spend, every single time I invest in a company, I try to meet with them on a monthly basis. I go to the board meetings. I try to be very thoughtful about, sort of how I, sort of engage in those sort of board meetings. I think Seth Bannon, sort of had a question, sort of on Twitter in relation to this, like, sort of shared portfolio company cover that we have, where even in the busiest days of Varda, I, still try to sort of make it to those, sort of board
Vinod
meetings.
Khosla says, I can't remember the exact number, so if Vinod's listening, don't kill me or sue me if I get it wrong. 80 to 90%, I'm just giving a range of VCs, actually detract value. Do you agree with that? People chat shit about venture investors like detracting value. How? How do they?
I think there's a couple of different causes. One of the, sort of worst outcomes is when a venture investor feels pressure from the firm, whether it's in the like, Uber case of we need liquidity, or one of the most, worst cases that I've seen is when it's your first sort of like quote unquote big deal, big investments. It's like the thing you feel like is defining your next 3, 4, 5 years at the firm. And that anxiety then creeps in where you're trying to force the founder into like, hey, I need a quick markup or XYZ sort of short-term progress. It's like not quite to the like public markets quarterly, sort of, hamster wheel, but it starts to approximate to that where you like, start to be really, really sort of short-term, sort of thinking focused and impose that anxiety upon the founder. Yeah, it ends up being this very dangerous piece of advice. And then probably the second is people that are just so decayed on operational skill sets, but still feel like they have really strong opinions on here's how you should do XYZ marketing, this candidate, et cetera. I just think that unless you have been, in a true operational day-to-day role in the last like, sort of 3 to 5 years in some ways, your ability to significantly, sort of provide, high quality advice really degrades. And the only way to keep it, at a top level is, I think, sort of how Keith does it, where he just gets so involved in each of the companies where, irrespective in theory, if he had not done open door, open store, et cetera, I still think he actually is able to maintain a sort of significant operational sense because he goes so deep and transitioned directly from operator, sort of to investor.
Speaking of that kind of operational now, so obviously you run Varda today. There's pros and cons. How does running Varda make you a better investor?
A multitude, if we go back to that sort of 5-point, sort of framework, there's a multitude that have been significantly positively impacted due to Varda. The first, just top of funnel, there's just a set of, founders that did not know me when I was just the Founders Fund investor versus now because the company is, an intriguing company, have heard of me sort of through that. Second, my ability to decide on what I would like to invest in significantly improved. In particular, I like to, go back to this example of there's this company that I led the, sort of seed round in Senra Systems, where the founder proactively chose to come meet me in Miami, even though he was based in Los Angeles because of, sort of the Varda connection. And then I was able to run an extremely extensive diligence over the following basically 36 hours after my initial meeting with him, because I was able to call people at Varda that had been his former manager, direct reports, had worked with him as a peer. And so the level of sort of depth of network that I have into this field allowed me to do, even for other really top tier aerospace investors, that type of diligence would have taken them probably weeks, sort of to do, to mine into that network, versus being so practically so close bare to the metal. You just have a much more extensive understanding of, sort of the people that day to day work in this, sort of field. The third is obviously, sort of close rate. I mentioned obviously this, sort of recent is not to say that I love investing in these like super, sort of hot competitive deals, but it's, sort of once I've sort of chosen that I do want to invest in something, since Varda, I have not, sort of lost an opportunity where I've wanted to invest, even in situations where there've been phenomenal partners, general partners on the other side of the table, offering competing, sort of term sheets.
Have you found a correlation between deal heat and success of company when you look back at your portfolio?
No, it's not to say that deal heat means it will not be successful, but if you look at the sort of returns, some were hot deals and some were not. And so, it's sort of like a wash, and I shouldn't really focus on it, right? Sword Health was like the epitome of not hot deal, random Portuguese company. There was nobody on the other side of the table. We sort of set terms. The ramp seed round had 5 or 6 other offers, and obviously was sort of super hot. Those are basically the two biggest outcomes, and on opposite sides of that sort of spectrum. And so I think it's actually just like uncorrelated. I think obviously at Founders Fund we definitely have a bias towards seeing it as a negative sort of factor, partially because it does typically end up affecting pricing. But I do think there's a set of like sort of hyper competent founders. I think in some ways at Varda we take this strategy, which is even in a competitive situation, we don't necessarily sort of take the highest priced offer that we have. In every Varda round, we've actually not taken the highest priced sort of offer. We've done what we thought was in the sort of appropriate, reasonable range that sets the company up for sort of long-term success. And so there are hot rounds where the founders are not sort of irrational, and we do like to invest in those at Founders Fund.
You mentioned Ramps round being a hot one. I remember Keith saying his biggest regret, or the thing that keeps him up most at night, is not paying 35 for Rippling. We mentioned Parker earlier. When Gary Tannen initialized did, Ramp was an expensive-ish seed round. I think it was like 25 or 30, whatever it was. Do you care about price, or do you align to Founders Fund's mentality of, if it's going to be a generational defining company, shut up and pay?
Sort of closer to the latter, but I do think it still needs to be sort of in family with what is reasonable for the status of the company, I guess, where, I think if you're just like, sort of 2-3x, sort of beyond, even if other investors are willing to offer it, it just means that you're going to make future decisions that are also similarly, sort of low quality. I think it's in some ways reflective of the quality of the, sort of founder. And so I think, sort of Ramp in some ways, it's not particularly unreasonable for a second time exited founder that, made money for investors for a seed round to be at, sort of 30 post, right? I think that's like not a particularly unreasonable pricing. In some ways, Parker obviously was, a similar, sort of situation. If you're like a first time founder and, demanding 25 post, I have a little bit of a harder time getting excited, even if in theory your vision is super compelling, your team is super compelling. It just shows a willingness to, sort of submit to the market instincts of venture capital rather than having your own sort of defined viewpoint on where you should sort of land. And so, but I think generally, I'm in the latter camp, and especially because most of the investing that I do is like below 150 posts. And so, sort of there, pricing is not as significant of a factor relative to growth stage, especially for a multi-stage firm where we can continue to double down and build our position.
How do you think about how your job has changed with the mimetic nature of Silicon Valley now realizing that the future is defense and we have to be in defense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, my partner Trey Stevens was obviously extremely, sort of early to this trend. I'd like to say, in summer 17, when I decided this was what I wanted to focus on, it was, not the, sort of typical path the junior VCs were obviously taking in the Valley, but I think has led to a lot of the success that I've had to date. And so it's been interesting to see that sort of flip on its head where, I had a former colleague, sort of Everett Randall, who's now a partner at KPCB, who would always critique me and say, Delian just loves these, sort of low margin, CapEx intensive businesses that are like highly, sort of dilutive. And this was in the like 2019, 2020 time frame where, sort of SaaS still felt like it was the sort of number one thing in the Valley. And in some ways, sort of those critiques, have gone away, even though the fundamental nature of the critique is still true, which is that these things are low margin, CapEx intensive, but ultimately that is where you build your, sort of moat. I always like to, the one liner that I sometimes like to use is people love software because, sort of the marginal distribution costs are zero, but perhaps what people need to realize is also that the marginal returns are zero as well, because there is no moat, because two standard Stanford kids, especially with today's AI, can replicate your, sort of SaaS for plumbers, effectively in a weekend. And so I think the job is odd now where I felt like, I was out on an island and now all of a sudden there's like 15 different venture firms that have, industrialization of America.
Can I be blunt? Do you not see the glib nature of that being, Service Titan, literally exactly that, SaaS for plumbers, cannot be replicated in a weekend with AI. There are intense workflows, deep functionality, a lot of brand credibility, trust, love. It's just not true.
I think that, sort of product, sort of statement, I would probably disagree with, where I think the like deep workflows, et cetera, if you're having to invent them for the first time by determining what your customers' workflows are versus, just replicating off of a, sort of known outcome, I think the ability to replicate that with, again, a team of 10, killer software engineers in AI just feels incredibly sort of quick today. I do think that, sort of distribution point and branding point is real, but then that's what people need to recognize is like, Service Titan is actually closer to LVMH than it is to Tesla. And that's fine. People should, sort of invest in, sort of brands that have, sort of great distribution. Clearly a return can be made there, but let's, sort of fundamentally recognize that these are, sort of not true technology companies.
How does the investor mind need to change with the transition to this very different world of investing that we now face? Like, many investors are high margin SaaS investors or consumer investors. This is a fundamentally entirely different asset class. It's not even comparable. How does the investor mind need to change to embrace this? And is the current generation of investors equipped?
What's funny is like this is actually what historical Silicon Valley was known for, right? Obviously, we became what we are because of the word silicon. We were a chips industry where you had to do extremely deep technical diligence. Things required quite a bit of capex to basically scale up. The fact that we had this sort of like low marginal cost, free distribution, very simple business model is sort of like a freak, sort of outcome of the like mid 2000s to the like sort of late 2010s. And I think in some ways we're sort of reverting to the mean where, if you look at the most successful investors from the 80s, 90s, et cetera, they look closer to, sort of a Vinod Khosla than a, sort of pure SaaS investor, sort of Jason, sort of Lemkin. And so I think what you will see is the, sort of profile of investors start to change. You need these very sort of broad polymaths that can, sort of get up to speed across biotech, material science, aerospace, et cetera, more so than people whose, sort of skill set purely sits in the world of like financial analysis and software engineering and product. And so there does need to be adaptation. I think what you'll realistically see is just the like sort of ranks of VCs will fundamentally change. I'm not sure that everyone is going to be capable of sort of reinventing themselves in this way. I just think the up and coming classes will look very different.
In 10 years, who will the top 3 VC firms be?
The sort of top 3 VCs a decade ago kind of look like the top 3 VCs today, and those will almost certainly basically be the top 3 VCs a decade from now. You are starting to see obviously people shift in fundamentally different directions, like Sequoia and A16Z becoming RIAs, maybe points towards a world where they're going to be scaling headcount, asset classes, et cetera, to the point where they start to resemble something more like BlackRock versus sort of the homegrown sort of VCs of the historical Silicon Valley arc. And I do generally believe that at least within the world of like seed, Series A technology companies, those are going to look more like the most successful ones are going to look more like the Founders Fund model of small teams focused specifically on that asset class versus just being a subset within a larger BlackRock looking like behemoth.
Who will be the biggest losers in the next 10 years of venture?
I think the sort of sector-specific specialized funds are going to sort of have a very tough time where, if you were a financial services or SaaS-focused fund, you for sure sort of had a wave that you could ride for a certain period of time. And it's not obvious that there will be that same wave again. Like Founders Fund is not a aerospace defense-focused investor. It happens to be that, we picked up on that trend and saw that there was going to be upcoming tailwinds far ahead of anybody else. But we also invested in Airbnb, Affirm, et cetera. And so I think in some ways, the firms that will struggle the most over the next 10 years are the ones that sort of have these artificial constraints on the types of investments that they're going to make that don't allow them to optimize for the reality of where is being disrupted and where are there going to be sort of generational returns. To maybe again go back to sort of one of Brian's classic isms internally is the only rule at Founders Fund is that there are no rules. If we establish any type of arbitrary rule, it almost certainly will basically decrease our sort of IRR. And so a lot of these like sort of specialist firms, I think, are going to have a really tough time when their sector sort of falls out of favor.
Do you mind if we talk about your Twitter?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. One of your tweets got me in particular. It, and I think you know where I'm going with this. It was where you said you can't take people seriously who are over 35 and straight and who don't have children and are married. It's a bold thing to put out there, Delian. Can you just talk to me about the thinking behind that tweet?
I just think in the technology industry, great, sort of companies, movements, technologies only get implemented with people that have extreme, sort of long-term thinking. And to me, the epitome of long-term thinking is recognizing that your time on this planet is, sort of very short. And what you're here ultimately to do is, sort of set it up well for the next generation. And in some ways, the epitome of that is recognizing that there needs to be a next generation and we have to be the ones to make them. Babies don't, come from storks. They come from people, sort of ideally, being married and having children. Obviously, unfortunately, there's a lot more being born out of wedlock today than not. And so I just see it as a sort of fundamental, sort of flaw. And to be clear, there is obviously exceptions to the rule. There are many successful sort of founder that are, sort of solo, sort of bachelors. Obviously, Alex Karp from sort of Palantir is doing pretty damn well, being at the helm of a $55 billion sort of company.
Do you know this is going to piss people off when you do it?
I think this goes back to maybe the beginning of the podcast, where I think in Bulgaria the default is just say what you think, and it doesn't really matter that much how society sort of reacts to it. And I used to feel very guilty when I was first, moving to San Francisco, and I would, say offensive things at the office that people found distasteful, or, in my early days of Twitter. And then I think at some point I've recognized, this is what I'm thinking, and it's what I would say in private conversation. I might as well, sort of be myself and say it out loud. It may sort of frustrate some people, but hopefully it helps some people either think different ways or become more attracted to, sort of working with someone like me. So I'd prefer to just be my honest and true self. And so I think I sometimes, if anything, my wife will confirm this, I sometimes am quite surprised that people are so, sort of put off by some of the things that I put out there. They just feel like very obvious thoughts to me.
Do you think people are too soft today?
Born and bred, sort of Americans that grow up within, sort of this, economy, culture, climate, et cetera, don't. They take for granted how special the United States is, our economic system, our political system, and don't recognize, how existential it can be if we sort of lose the current system and how bad the rest of the world is. And so I do think that obviously makes people extraordinarily soft. I'll maybe use the sort of Netanyahu quote from the congressional, sort of speech that he gave yesterday, which is, there were protesters outside of, Capitol Hill that had signs that, said, sort of gays for Gaza. And he was like, you might as well be saying that, we're chickens for, sort of KFC, they would eat you alive there. And I think that's like a perfect example of just like the softness of the, sort of next generation, because they take for granted that you can even be gay in this country.
Do you think we work as hard as we used to?
I think the obviously fundamental answer there is, no. I think if you look at the obviously, average working hours, sort of today relative to obviously like, sort of factory labor and the Industrial Revolution in the 1920s, the objective answer is no. Magnitude of effort is always an important thing to compete on, but, so is direction. And I think the important thing about, sort of society becoming more and more wealthy is that for the people that choose to work very, very hard, we continue to allow them to be rewarded. We're not Europe where we try to, sort of steal the wealth of the most successful, sort of away from them. And we, in some ways, enable them to have even more, sort of infrastructure to, be as productive as they would like to be. If you look at the sort of tools available to me in order to be productive relative to even, John Rockefeller in the 1920s, the amount of work that I can put in and the preciseness of the direction is far more direct. There were so many things in Rockefeller's life. There were sort of, inefficiencies, whether it was like, communication, transportation, et cetera. And so I think what you're going to see is this bifurcation where almost certainly there will be more and more people that work less, but there will also be these hyper efficient people that are augmented by AI, have more wealth, have more people around them that actually become even more productive and efficient. And so the answer in some ways is like yes and no. The average, yes, has gone down, but the sort of tail extremes, I think, are only going to go up even further.
And for everyone listening, Delian is wrong. Europe do not tax and take away all of your wealth if you make money. I know I pay the tax. I pay the highest tax bracket. Some countries do take more, but sadly, no. Anyway, I do have to ask, dude, I was chatting to Sean Maguire before this, and he was like, you got to talk to him about marrying up. I did it. What is your biggest advice on marrying up and finding your life partner?
The biggest mistake that I see people go into sort of the stage of life where they're prioritizing finding their lifelong partner is they come into that process with a pre-prescribed notion of what they think their ideal partner looks like, whether that be a set of attributes, a list, particular, family archetype, et cetera. They come in with these very sort of strong predisposed notions. I came into that process sort of with that similar sort of list myself, and arbitrarily one of the things on that list in some ways was I really believed that my wife needed to be a really good skier. Skiing was an incredibly important, or still is an incredibly important sport in my life. It's how my family hangs out, together all on Christmas Day. And so I felt that how would somebody possibly integrate into my familial life basically without that? And then it turns out my wife, who I very much so married up for, it was a sort of god-awful skier, and bless her heart, at least allowed me to sort of teach her some amount to get her to mediocrity rather than being god-awful. But I think it's recognizing that you probably don't even realize, sort of what that ideal person looks like. Use the instincts of what you've built, and what worked well in sort of prior relationships, and try to find the person where you can most be yourself, and they just by default love that. In my early, sort of dating life, I always felt like there was sort of something wrong and something that I needed to edit out of myself, and that was going to make me the better, sort of boyfriend, better, sort of potential, sort of husband. And I would get critiques from the, sort of girlfriends at the time. They were like, I like a lot of you, but there's this 10% that, is maybe the more volatile or the crazier or the thing that, posts the bombastic things on Twitter that I would love you to edit. I think ultimately the, sort of thing that made me realize that my wife was, the one was where I could just be 100% of myself. And she actually loved, sort of all aspects of it. And so then rather than not being myself, I could actually just even more be myself. And she'd love that, basically even more. Yeah. Feel very grateful to have her as my life partner.
Delian, sex, laughter, honesty, and respect. Rank them 1 through 4 in importance.
Probably honesty first, because I feel like in some ways the rest of that, doesn't matter unless you have that.
I'm like, honesty 1, does it matter if I don't like your mother? Really? Honesty? No. But I get you. So we would have honesty 1.
Honesty 1, and then maybe the controversial one is, I'd actually, maybe put, sex second, where I do think, sort of that, type of physical connection is, I think Zuckerberg actually had an interesting, sort of quote yesterday in his Emily Chang interview, where he talked about how much he just does not believe in the idea of plug yourself into a computer and upload your consciousness. We're so much more than just our brains. We are the bodies, the sensations, et cetera. And so in some ways, sort of sex in a relationship is the sort of epitome of that, and needs to be, sort of second. And then it's probably, sort of laughter, in that I think, life is a difficult thing. The fact that it's so short is a difficult thing. You have to deal with many hardships. And if you don't have laughter, you may not be able to get through that. And then, probably fourth is respect, where I do think it's important, but when I think about it in the sort of ranking of all of those, it is probably sort of fourth most important. If you've got sort of honesty, sex, and laughter, in some ways respect probably falls out of that.
You have children, and you are a father now. My question to you is, in what ways have you changed most unexpectedly since becoming a father?
I probably didn't expect how much my sort of default mood would improve by having a child. It was definitely something that I felt very ready for. I was excited by. I knew that it would bring me sort of a lot of joy. But there is just this very base level of, the fact that you get all these endorphins released every single morning when you pick up this just beautiful, happy child that just screams and giggles and plays, etc., and just evokes your inner child. Even when you're in the midst of what feel like the most existential, stressful, et cetera, situations, and you're, going through, these professional crises, in some ways, I feel like all of that washes away when you have just this joyous, sort of child to sort of begin every single day. And that just erases, I don't know, anything that you could have in terms of, sort of stress, depression, mood dampener.
What is your most radical thought that you have not tweeted yet that you would like to?
I've sort of, hinted at this some amount, in various tweets, but maybe, sort of not said it super explicitly. But I do think the sort of biggest geopolitical and moral crisis that humanity will have over the course of the next minimum 100, but sort of maybe it is closer to 150 to 200 years, is sort of fundamentally that humanity is almost certainly going to be sort of speciating, where both with artificial selection pressures from things like polygenic risk scoring of embryos to eventual sort of CRISPRing of sort of embryos where you're changing DNA, to natural selection pressures of people being on sort of Moon, Mars, and low Earth orbit stations. will fundamentally, sort of create a new dynamic that we have not had, in the last effectively, sort of 15, sort of 20,000 years, where people don't appreciate that we all happen to be sort of Homo sapiens, like the only, sort of intelligent, conscious beings on the planet happen to be, sort of Homo sapiens. Almost certainly, we will have Homo Luna, Homo Martia, Homo, Cosma, and, Homo Neanderthal and Erectus, sort of may come back as people decide to, sort of optimize or, sort of bring back some of those genomes. And if we think we have sort of divisiveness today, where at least everybody on the planet can mate with one another and, produce children, in the future, that will not be the case. And I fear for, humanity's survival in that, sort of outcome, given, sort of how close we feel to the brink of nuclear war constantly when we're all at least the same species, and, sort of how much worse that, sort of may be when we feel like we're, not necessarily all the same species.
Delian, listen, I want to move into a quick fire round. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay? So who is the single best board member you sit on a board with?
Probably have to be Seth Bannon from 50 Years. I think he, sort of dives, sort of deep into the companies that he's involved in, and, sort of asks some sort of pretty great pointed questions.
Which board member have you not sat on a board with but would most like to? Or which VC have you not sat on a board with but would most like to?
I've gotten to observe at True Work, sort of Alfred Lin, and, would love to, sort of one day find something where we're actually both the sort of board members. I imagine, though, that given our, sort of not super overlapping interests, that may or may not happen, but that would be one that I would love to experience.
What have you changed your mind on most in the last 12 months?
I have tried to tone down how much on Twitter I sort of attack the individual versus, sort of attack the idea. And I think, obviously I've made sort of plenty of enemies in Silicon Valley, and some of them I'm sort of comfortable with. Some I've done somewhat, sort of unintentionally, where I was, sort of more meaning to attack the idea and the principle than the actual person, and I actually quite enjoyed the person. And so probably have changed my mind on, how okay it is to attack the person, let's say.
Do you give a shit when PG fights back? Do you get worried?
I think at the end of the day, it's better to, and I think this goes back to one of my early answers, it's better for people, at least the founders that have to choose who they work with, to understand the character of the people that they're going to be working with. And so I generally prefer for more transparency and honesty with how people truly, sort of think about, sort of one another and their preferences than not. And so, I'm generally pro, I think, him sort of fighting back.
Have you ever been pulled aside in Founders Fund for your Twitter?
Oh, a multitude of times. I mean, I've probably had at least, sort of 6, Singerman, sort of one-on-ones where he has to be like, Delian, what the fuck? But thankfully those have generally decreased in frequency. I think, especially in the early days, it was like, sorry, I'm such an idiot, I'll try to do better in the future. And then I think, thankfully, I did generally do better in the future. So thankfully, I think, Brian has not had to do one of those now sit down one-on-ones. And I think 2 years and a month. So of my 5 years at Founders Fund, I think we're at least getting to the point where now I'll be past, 50% of the time Brian having to sit me down versus not.
What character trait are you slightly ashamed of, but also has contributed to your success?
I am not somebody who always handles existential sort of stress and threat well, in that it really does impact sort of my, sort of quality of sleep, physical, mental health in a sort of significant way, such that I do require sort of more unplugging than is ideal. Like when I look at some of the true sort of greatest entrepreneurs and founders, right? If you read about, sort of Elon, Steve, et cetera, they're clearly able to, even the most stressful moments of their company's lives, grind through the 12 to 14-hour days, pull all-nighters, et cetera, and be sort of fresh and ready, sort of the following day. And that's just like not something that I'm capable of. If I have to pull an all-nighter, I'm like wrecked, not for like a single day, but like for like a week afterwards in terms of being sort of fully productive. And so what that has led me to doing is making sure to surround myself with people that are like that. So, so my co-founder, Will Brewy, is very much so one of those types where like rallies the team, grinds through, can, operate on 4 hours of sleep and still be high energy, high functioning, et cetera. Obviously, he doesn't want to necessarily do that for months at a time. And so in some ways, even though it's been my greatest flaw, I think because I've recognized it as my flaw, it has forced me to spend far more energy on finding people that can basically, sort of mitigate that flaw.
Final one for you. What question are you never asked that you should be asked, do you think?
Funny when I saw this, on the agenda, one of the, sort of things that I was going to say is, people sometimes, don't ask enough, why did you decide to, sort of not be sort of founder CEO of Varda? And it does basically come down to, sort of this, where I actually, sort of think that, and this may, sort of trend over time, maybe over the course of the next decade or two, as I continue to gain experience, become hopefully more emotionally and mentally, sort of mature, I'm able to do that CEO job. But I do think that, the question I'm not asking enough is, why didn't you do the CEO job? And it's because I'm not 100% convinced that I could be in the, sort of top, sort of 0.1% of CEOs, versus I am very convinced that my co-founder is able to. And so I need to focus on the thing that I can, I think, be 0.1% in. And that is a bit more of the sort of president chairman role.
Delian, listen, I've absolutely loved having you on. As I said, I've wanted to do this for a while. Thank you so much for putting up with my meandering across different questions. You've been fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me on, Harry. It was really pleasant.